I'm the row crop pathologist for Virginia Tech. I'm stationed at the Tidewater AREC in Suffolk, Virginia. It's good to be here today. It's a nice morning to have a field day, a really nice morning. So I want to thank the crew here at the Eastern Virginia AREC for putting in this trial for me. Joseph Oakes planted a couple of different varieties here on November the 11th. The one on your right is Dynagrow 9811, and the one on your left here is Shirley. Now, what I wanted was I wanted to have a little bit different levels of disease resistance. So one variety gets one disease a little bit worse than the other, and Shirley is one that we see a lot of Fusarium head blight in. It doesn't have good resistance to Fusarium head blight. So if we were to see a lot of Fusarium head blight, and I was actually able to find one head that I am pretty certain has Fusarium head blight out here, which is a good thing, because that means we've been at very low risk for Fusarium head blight this year. So it's good not to find a lot. But what he also did was, if you notice the yellow stake, and the yellow stake is going to be in the first five, in the middle of the first 5 rows on the left-hand side of the plot in each one. That's where he made an application of Maravus Ace on April the 13th at flowering, which is generally when we put on a Fusarium head blight type application. So that's really more of a head blight application. What you're not going to be able to see is a big difference between where he sprayed and where he didn't, because we don't have a lot of Fusarium head blight. What you might be able to see over here in the Dynagrow 9811 is you'll see some of the you see what looks like a little bit of gloom blotch up on some of the heads. You'll see a little bit more of it where he did not spray, and I have seen more gloom blotch or Staganospora on 9811 in the past, mostly on the foliage, but it does, our concern is mostly what gets on the head. So if you have a chance to walk out there, you might actually at least I was able to see a difference there in where I sprayed a fungicide and I didn't. So Fusarium head blights is probably the disease we are concerned about the most in wheat typically. It's one that would be more of a concern year to year. But then you have different years like this year where some other diseases pop up and they cause problems. One in particular was powdery mildew. We saw a little bit more powdery mildew in wheat this year than we've seen in the past. Powdery mildew is a disease that doesn't require a lot of rain to be a problem. We typically think of real rainy, wet weather, we see more disease. Powdery mildew can do pretty well without as much rain. And so it's been a little bit below average rainfall this year and cool. And at least to me, in my opinion, and I've talked to others, it's been a little bit cool this spring compared to other springs. Powdery mildew is favored by cooler weather and just enough moisture in the morning with a heavy dew to keep it going. So in some fields we've had reports of powdery mildew showing up, and it's pretty severe. Some of it was even early on in late March, and it's mostly showing up in varieties that don't have good resistance to powdery mildew. Well, if you don't see powdery mildew all the time, you're not necessarily going to think about planting powdery mildew resistant varieties. So it shows up here and there in certain varieties that don't have good resistance to that particular pathogen. Generally, when we see powdery mildew getting started, we'll use a fungicide application earlier than we would normally spray for head blight, maybe boot stage or flag leaf, fully emerged flag leaf, where you can see the ligule on the flag leaf. Is when we would make an early application for something like powdery mildew or something like leaf rust. I haven't seen any stripe rust this year. Things like septoria, Sometimes septoria is a problem, sometimes not, or gloom blotch. Usually it requires scouting. You've got to be able to, finding the disease. Some people spray preventively. Your fungicides are always going to be more effective if you apply a fungicide prior to infection. They can still be somewhat effective if you apply a fungicide after infection, but not nearly as effective as if you would have sprayed before infection. So I know some people have sprayed for powdery mildew, and some of the susceptible varieties of powdery mildew is still maintained and was able to cause some problems. A lot of times when you see a good bit of sporulation and a lot of damage, you're not going to be real satisfied with your spray when you make an application at that point, because it's not, even though a product like propiconazole, which is a tilt, or a lot of people using the generic fitness, it does have some kickback activity, but not generally enough to just eliminate an outbreak, especially when you've got favorable condition. I don't see any powdery mildew out here in these plots. Another disease that cropped up this year, and we've heard complaints about, is barley yellow dwarf. And we've heard a good bit about barley yellow dwarf this year relative to previous years, and we always see a little bit here and there, but not like we saw this year. I think the key to some of the fields that we've seen the worst barley yellow dwarf is some of the fields that were earlier planted, because it's transmitted by aphids. Aphids are more active earlier in the fall when it's warmer. There's more ability to transmit, and that's where you see most of your losses. So that's where you see these groups of plants in the field not long after green up that are kind of stunted, yellow. There seems to be kind of a focal point near the center where kind of the infection took place initially, and then it kind of spreads out from there, and it tends to be a little bit linear because the aphids are going to travel from plant to plant down a row a lot easier than there are across rows. So sometimes it looks a little elongated or in a streak. It doesn't have to, but it often appears that way. So a lot of it is about the aphids. And then I had a question about, I don't feel very comfortable talking about entomology. So I'm not an entomologist, but I do know that some of the insecticide seed treatments have been promoted in reducing barley yellow dwarf, but there's not a lot of product there. And I think we'll even see a good bit of barley yellow dwarf even if we did use some of those. Then some some folks may ask, well, if aphids are transmitting this disease, if we can control the aphids, we should be able to limit the amount of disease we see. And that's fairly intuitive. It doesn't necessarily work that way. It's never really been shown that foliar insecticides have been able to manage barley yellow dwarf. You can manage aphids. If you see a heavy infestation of aphids, yes, you can make a spray and control the aphids, but it doesn't necessarily, because those aphids, once they feed, depending on the acquisition time and the weather conditions, they can transmit the virus and be killed later once you see enough of them. But you're not necessarily, it's never been really recommended to spray for aphids to control barley yellow dwarf. And that's the same for a lot of aphid transmitted viruses in a lot of different crops. Is that insecticides, while it's intuitive to try to control the vector, the timing has to be so specific to be effective that it's really hard to hit the right time, and you've got to do a lot of scouting, and you've got to look really hard. I can't imagine how many times I've been in virus infested fields where there's almost 100% virus in the field, so insects have been out there transmitting the virus, and the grower will tell me, I hadn't seen any aphids. There's been an aphid here because it doesn't take a ton of them to be able to transmit a lot more virus than you'd like to see. So it's very difficult to control any virus disease with an insecticide. The one thing that I would note, though, is that the earlier infections, the infections that were noted early on at green up, those are the ones that are primarily going to cause most of the yield loss in those areas where you see those bad spots. You will also see purpling flag leaves this time of year. So the wheat plant, everything looks great other than it has a kind of a purple flag leaf, which is still barley yellow dwarf, but that's a spring infection. So once that plant has made a seed head, those, you won't see hardly any damage in yield from a late infection. So if you're concerned about seeing a lot of barley yellow dwarf on flag leaves, I wouldn't be too concerned about that as far as something that's going to be yield limiting, because we see that a lot. The timing of the infection is key. Earlier the infection, the worse yield loss. Later infection, not so much. So that's not something I would be overly concerned about. What I would be concerned about is trying to figure out how to deal with the barley yellow dwarf that we're seeing from infections that occur in the fall. The biggest, the recommendation that I would give, and the ones that I've talked to others about, that they typically recommend later planting. Plant when aphids are less active and when aphids are less likely to be transmitting the disease. I would dare say that you see most of your problems with early infections in fields where you had earlier planted wheat, September planted wheat.
Late infections, does that bother test weight?
Not so much. I think at least from what I've read, because it's hard to have a barley yellow dwarf test, as you can imagine, is that it's almost non-significant to be able to detect that difference. You might see a small difference, yes, if you had a really closed experiment. You might be able to detect something there, but field wide you might not be able to notice it. And it still occurs sporadically, so you'll see a patch of purple leaves, and then you'll walk out of it and you won't see any for a while, and you might find another patch. And it basically is based on aphids coming in, feeding, aphids acquiring the virus from the original infected plant, and then being able to transmit to plants close to it. So usually it's kind of like little, a lot of times you'll see it more on the field edge, because the aphids are a lot of times coming in from the edge of the field, but it looked like little bombs went off in some areas where in those early infections, just yellow area.
I've got a question here. Back when I used to get paid for saying something, I would tell people that, always put imidacloprid, which is the seed treatment. Well, it was originally gaucho, I think. It was $5 a unit. Well, the price of the imidacloprid has come down so much. I guess it's still down. I would tell people, always apply imidacloprid as a seed treatment, regardless, because it was so cheap and easy. And it looked to me like it was working. So would you agree that as a seed treatment, as cheap as it is, that they should apply imidacloprid?
Okay, the question is, the topic that was brought up was, should I use imidacloprid on my wheat seed to reduce losses to barley yellow dwarf, as cheap as it is? I'm not an entomologist now, so we're talking about an insecticide, but I'm going to apply my thought process to it, which is often wrong, but a lot of times it's right, is that if I was going to plant early wheat, earlier planted wheat, if that was how I was set up, if that was what I was planning on doing, I would make sure that the imidacloprid was at least on the earliest wheat that I planted. And if you wanted to cut costs and drop the imidacloprid out, I would drop it out in the later planted wheat.
I was sort of curious as the seedsmen here, their experience in putting it on and not putting it on.
Yeah, I would be more inclined to talk to our entomologist, Dr. Sally Taylor, about that. But in the literature that I've read, I haven't seen a lot of, when they recommend control practices in several other states, they don't list the seed treatment as a control practice. Even though intuitively, imidacloprid is very good on Pearson sucking insects like aphids, it's generally not thought of as a major control tool.
Somebody speak up. I mean, I'm just
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I haven't seen enough compelling information to be able to recommend that. But once again, if I felt strongly enough about it, I would probably use it in my earliest planted wheat, and maybe not so much in my later planted wheat when aphid populations are lower. Especially if you're planting really late and insect populations are almost zero, I probably wouldn't use it. If it was a big, if it cost a significant amount of money.
If you're planting before the frost-free date, it probably also would help with Hessian fly to use that seed treatment.
What's that?
If you're planting before the frost-free date, like you said, the early planting probably would help with Hessian fly as well as.
It's probably the comment was made that it would the use of the seed treatment would probably help more with the Hessian fly if you're planting before the frost-free date,
As well as yellow dwarf.
and possibly with barley yellow dwarf. But overall, I wish there was a little bit more. I shouldn't wish that, because if I was seeing a lot of disease here, you'd probably be having a lot more problems in your field. But I did find one head. If you want to see a head that's got some fusarium head blight, just getting started, I walked through both sections, and I did find this in the untreated, so that's one good thing. But I will say, in my trials at Tifton, I'm going back to Tifton, Georgia, where I used to work. In Suffolk, Virginia, we inoculated with fusarium head blight, so I do see a good bit more in my trials where I'm comparing fungicides, and I do see where some of the fungicides are reducing the amount of fusarium head blight that I see. But it's really, it's a very early rating. I would feel more comfortable talking about those differences once we get all the data. Anything I've left out, or anything you wish I'd have talked about but didn't, or something I did talk about that you have a question on? But you can feel free to walk out here and look at the plots. Once again, the first 5 rows, the yellow stake is in the middle row of the 5 that was treated with fungicide. The next 5 rows, so it ends where I put the orange flag. So these 5 rows here are untreated. Pretty much the same scenario over here in the Dynagrow. You may see a little more discoloration of the glooms in the untreated, in the Dynagrow.